Hi everybody, thank you for joining. In this video we have a 1970 Omega Speedmaster Professional. I just picked it up at the flea market for nothing. That's because it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to Mike. He did get a very good deal on this watch because it was included in a bundle of items in an auction lot. So it's a little bit like one of those Ferrari and the old barn stories. This watch won't fully wind, so it seems to have a broken mainspring. If you were to send this watch to Omega for service, it would be near as makes no difference $1,000 in several weeks. Now that's not to imply that that's not worth it, because Omega does service this watch at a very high level. It does replace or tend to replace a number of parts as preventative maintenance. But $1,000 is a lot of money. Mike is a veteran, he's retired, and a caregiver to his wife. He loves watches. He's a buddy of mine, so I wanted to help him out. Some gunk here around the pushers. Go ahead and release the stem. I'm going to assume this is not your first watch video, and we're going to skim over a few things. I'm not going to show every step in great detail. You guys have seen the hands removed, I'm sure. I really wanted to give more of an overview. We're just going to loosen these dial screws to remove the dial. There are a couple of really good YouTube videos on servicing these, but I really encourage you to download the service manual, the Omega service manual. I believe I got mine from cousins.uk. Use that as a guide for what parts to lubricate and where to lubricate them. It's hard to tell in the video exactly where that lubrication is going. That service manual will be very helpful for that. And also, you don't want to assume that whoever you're watching is always correct. So anyway, hopefully this serves more of inspiration. Maybe you've been thinking about getting into the hobby. I'll say that this has been one of the most enjoyable hobbies that I've had. And I've had some interesting ones. I was, not all that long ago, a high-speed driving instructor, so I basically instructed people how to drive quickly around a racetrack. Some changes came, and I had to sort of reprioritize my time. And I just could not fit the track hobby into my lifestyle. Obviously, working on these watches at home, I can kind of just do it whenever I can do it. And the tools aren't all that expensive. You don't have to buy the finest tools to start with. I think I'm still using a very inexpensive set of screwdrivers, a very inexpensive set of tweezers, and I am slowly sort of building my tool set up. But you really do not need to blow the budget on every tool you see on every YouTube channel to get started in this hobby. I'm going to put this screw back into the movement to help me keep these organized. This plastic will help prevent scratches while prying on that spring. As a matter of fact, you can do a lot with very few tools. It's not uncommon to see that kind of, I guess, behavior in a lot of hobbies. People get in the golf, they decide they need, the finest golf clubs. At the racetrack, you would sometimes see people with little or even no track experience arrive in cars with gobs of horsepower, racing slicks. The suspension's been changed out to sort of a track setup. And it really was a disservice because while the car itself might have been capable, it wasn't friendly in a way that they could learn to push the limit. So it really held them back. So yeah, if you're interested in starting in the hobby, then you could do like what I did and start with pocket watches. They tend to have fewer parts. The parts are larger, so they're more robust. So when you're learning, you can be a little clumsy sometimes, so they'll be more resistant to your errors, and they hold up better over time. And frankly, they are just amazing pieces. I have some pocket watches that are over 120 years old, and they keep time within a second a day. Then you can shift to, three-hand wristwatch movements. And then eventually, if you like chronographs like me, well, you can work on a chronograph. Most of my chronograph experience is on Seiko movements, particularly the 6139 series. That's one of my favorite series of chronographs. I have a little bit of experience with some early Venus chronographs and Landeron. This is the 861 caliber from Omega. I'm not sure how loaded the spring is, so I'm going to hold it down just in case. Well, nothing's gone flying yet, so that's good. We'll tighten that screw back down and remove this little post. This wheel is pressure fit pretty firmly, so I'm going to use this plastic and these two inexpensive levers to pry that up. The 861 caliber is an evolution of the 321 caliber, which is what was in the watch that went to the moon. And now we're finally getting to removing the cock, or technically it's a bridge since it has two screws that holds the pallet fork in place. I'm not old enough to remember. I was actually born after the lunar landing. Mike, though, might be old enough to have a memory of the lunar landing. I do remember having a toy lunar landing module, though. It was probably one of my favorites. I do tend to keep my parts sort of organized. Even during cleaning, I'll keep them in multiple baskets as opposed to just sort of lumping them together in random baskets. You know, when I do that, I can figure it out. It does slow me down a little bit, but you know, you'll find a system that works for you. So does the squeaky screwdriver bother you guys? Because it actually, I find it a little helpful for me when I'm editing the video. It gives me a reference point. I kind of like the sound of it. But if it really bothers you guys, I'll see what I can do about that squeak. Just let me know what you think. Oops, never happened. This movement has two plates that raise the dial above the main plate. They also have some of the chronograph's works underneath there. And once again, we'll get this screw back so that I keep up with where things go. Remove the hour wheel there. Now we'll get into the setting lever system here. The French watch collector, great channel if you're not already watching him, diligently puts his screws back to where they came from. And it's a very good practice. I am working on that. I'm not as consistent as I should be. There's another spring here I'm holding in place with this Rodico as I pull the clutch off. And we'll use our cannon pinion tool to do none other than remove the cannon pinion. And our center wheel, which was held onto the cannon pinion. And we'll get the second dial plate off. We're getting really close to having this disassembled, and we'll work on getting it ready for cleaning. There's a little bit of grease here and there that I see. We'll want to probably have use pegwood to remove. Going to tighten these screws back up so they don't get lost in the cleaning process. They will work themselves loose, and they are easy to lose. So yeah, I'll use pegwood to kind of remove the extra grease. This wheel's being a little stubborn, so I'm going to use these tweezers that I bent. They've actually come in handy on a couple of things. A little bit of pegwood to prepare this for cleaning. It's really dried on there. And while I'm at it, I'll use a little isopropyl alcohol, see how much cleaner I can get it. Once I get the big gunk off the parts, I'll get these into the ultrasonic cleaner. I use a non-water system, rinsing in isopropyl alcohol. Check out these tiny little screws on this plate over the barrel. This setup is actually not something I've seen before. It's interesting. And I'm back with my special tweezers, and oh, nearly got away. And this is where you need to be careful as you unwind the mainspring. I can see that it's broken in there. It's broken at the... As I was saying, the mainspring was broken at the tail, so it would probably sometimes wind rather erratically. It might run for, who knows, maybe an hour, a few minutes, all depended on how it would grip without that tail. So got our new mainspring here, and I'm working to make sure it's all seated fully, being very careful so that it doesn't spring out. And I'm just going to put a little bit of oil. Not a lot, just a little bit of oil in there. Press this down with this little tool. We still have some parts drying. Meanwhile, we'll lubricate our stem here and our sliding clutch pinion. Get the sides here and the tip. Let's see if we can thread this into the movement. You can't just drop it in there from the top. It has to kind of be threaded in. We'll temporarily tighten our screw here to hold the stem in place. A little lubrication here on the lever. And a touch inside here. Again, you want to refer to that service manual. Put a little lubrication on the sides of our clutch where it slides into the sliding pinion there. Press that in, make sure that's set. You can kind of see how things operate. I like to kind of actuate things and make sure I've got grease in the right spots, and maybe add some if I need to. Now see if we can fit in our spring here without sending it into orbit. Hold it down with a little flat piece of wood. I believe that's a coffee stir, but it works really well. And again, these posts and these parts, I'm just referring to the Omega service manual. And we'll drop these little intermediate wheels in. They appear to be identical. A little oil on this post. And we'll get this spring plate. That's a cover with a little spring for our setting lever. I usually only tighten these part way down until I get that spring set. Then once we get that spring set, I'll go back and tighten this down all the way. That feels good. Now for one of the more delicate parts of the service, I'm going to lift our cap jewel out of here. After cleaning it in some alcohol for a little bit, we'll put a little drop of oil, get it back over this bearing jewel. I'm not oiling, just to be clear, I'm using the clean oiler to just kind of pull that off the jewel and get it, pull that off the Rydeco and get the jewel in place. So now we can place this dial support on. Service guide recommends lubricating there, and this tiny little pinion point there. Again, referring to our service guide for lubrication. And you can see where that area contacts that wheel. A little bit of Mobius oil here. Actually, I had to hold that screw with tweezers to get that started. And we'll get this little tricky guy in place. So tiny. I actually just threaded that partly. And now I'm going to go back and tighten these down. A little bit of lubrication here and here with the barrel contact. And some oil here where the center post goes. Typically, if you see me using the red oiler, that's got a heavier grease on it, and with the black one, I've got a lighter lubrication on it. The lighter oil I use is 9010, Mobius 9010, and then I'll also use D5. I have a couple other oils, but those are the ones that I use primarily. Let's see if I can drop this without disrupting the oil too much. And this was a tight fit, and I'm gonna have to press it down with some wood. Luckily the screw hole is aligned and I can get that in without too much fuss. Now we can start piecing together our train of wheels. Just being very careful with those pivots. Try and make sure that they're in the pivot hole, because you don't want to start trying to get the plate on if the bottom's not in, because it just makes it harder. We'll manipulate this a little bit until we get things close enough to where we can start moving the wheels around. Sometimes you're lucky and things just drop into place, but more often than not, you have to kind of rework things a little bit and nudge here and there, just with the gentlest sort of nudge. Sometimes I'll tap here on the side to get things to drop into place. You'll be surprised how often that will work. And I think we're getting pretty close, and nope, not quite. Just got to be patient. And there we go. There we go. That feels right. I'm going to sound like a broken record and mention the service manual again. Not every wheel gets oil, because the oil can actually increase drag so that the chronograph wheels won't rotate properly. So don't assume everything gets oil. Download the service manual and just follow it as you go. Let it be your friend. Just a little nudge to see if we can get it in. That seemed close. Go ahead and thread this part way, and we'll check to see how our alignment is. A little nudge. Yep, perfect. This wheel is pressure fit, and I was going to use my jewel setting tool here to precisely press that wheel down over the jewel, which you also have to take care not to press out. But there wasn't enough clearance. So what I did is I just took the jewel setting die there and just kind of placed it underneath and did this by hand. And I'm not pressing it exactly into place. I just want to get it tight. It has to be aligned very precisely with another wheel. Once I get that wheel on the movement, I'll come back to this tool and finish setting that. Sometimes, depending on how skillful I'm feeling, I'll go ahead and have the stones on the pallet fork oiled. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and install the pallet fork, and then I'll come back with the special oil that's made for the escapement. I'm only going to tighten these partly, and then I'm going to test that the pallet fork is operating smoothly, that it doesn't bind. And this is a clean oiler, not contaminating it. And again, I'm being very careful. I'm going to tighten this down a little bit more, and then I'm going to check it again before I fully tighten. That looks fine. And you know, you're not wrenching these screws tight. You just want to snug them up a little bit. You don't want to go back and say, I'll make it a little tighter. Really, that's tight enough. And we'll add some oil to that side of the pallet that strikes the escape wheel, the exit sided in particular there. And we'll advance the escape wheel by clicking the tail back and forth. And I'm using different oilers for the oiling and striking the fork there to advance the wheel. So 2 different oilers. You definitely don't want to be putting oil right there because that's where the impact stone from the balance goes, and that will cause problems. And that starts right up. That's always a bit, it's a moment of relief when you see that. I honestly could stare at a balance till I fell asleep, I think. And we'll work on getting this spring up so we can get to this stone on the other side of the balance. We already did the dial side for the balance. And we'll give this a good alcohol bath, dry it, and a tiny drop of oil, about the same size as the previous side that we did. And we'll close her up. So we have the watch part of this done. So the timekeeping aspect of it is complete. So now, once we get this closed up, we can move on to our chronograph. Now remember, this is one of several screws that I screwed back into the movement to keep from losing them. So you'll see me removing these. I know it might look confusing, but believe me, if you do this, you'll understand why it's a good idea, particularly when there's so many parts. I'm just gonna use this pegwood to see if I can push this spring out so I can get that little piece pressed down in place. There you can see how they're engaged. Again, refer to our service manual for proper lubrication. The manual specifies 2 kinds of lubrication, a heavier grease here and a lighter oil here. This post interacts with the reset, goes down in here, and there's a little spring. Here we go. That will put some tension to help return it back into place. Hold this down with some pegwood and see if I can press this in without it flying off, please. Feels like it's in, but okay. I felt like I've had those springs in before, and they've just flown across the room. This little metal piece here interacts with the hour recorder. And this is for our reset mechanism. And this little screw holds that in place. And we've got some screws to remove. A little lubrication here. Now this piece here has several points of contact that need lubrication. So I'm definitely going off the manual here. And we'll remove these screws where it goes into place. see if we can drop this in here without making too much of a oily mess on top of the plate here. Slide that button down there, and that's the start stop button, or not the actual button, but the button's actually on the case. These are kind of like little internal stems for the buttons. Clean up my mess. I think I read there's something like 128 parts to this movement, and this, in my mind, is the strangest one. It's so weird. It's like this loose jigsaw puzzle, a system that kind of interacts to make this whole thing work. It's really impressive someone figured this out. Now this piece interacts with that spring we just put on and also has a notch for a little post, but I'm going to get this screw on here partially and see if we can fit this correctly. Now I can push that piece over. I need to get that over so I can get the spring to engage it so it gets tension loaded on it. And once I have tension loaded on that part, I can then push this back over the post, and now we're engaged. And we can tighten this down. And we'll just check this. Get this recording wheel in place. We'll get these two wheels meshed up so that the teeth are aligned. That's good. Need a little oil here on the post as per the service manual. And now we can get our chronograph cock in place. That's not the best job of placement, so I'm going to have to sort of nudge this around. Just put a little tiny bit of pressure and see if I can work. Here we go. Work those pivots into the pivot holes. That feels good. So I'm not oiling, I'm actually using this to move this spring over so that I can press this down into place. Often get asked, how do you remember where everything goes? Well, sometimes I don't. And it takes me a while to figure it out. You can always reference your photos and videos. So it's important to make sure you document things along the way. This movement and the right light is just stunning. It's definitely a cut above just an industrial design. And this is actually the wheel that I mentioned earlier that interacts with this wheel we pressed on. These have to mesh very precisely or else it will cause some problems. So we're going to nudge this into place. We'll get the screw tightened down, and then we'll go back to the jeweling tool so that we can press that wheel down very precisely. And since we pressed the wheel down earlier, there is just enough clearance to get the movement in between the two dies here. When I'm tilting the jeweling tool up, what I'm doing, I'm checking the alignment of the teeth. And just by fractions of a millimeter, I can tighten this tool and press that wheel down. And we're good. We can raise this up and gently lift the movement out to not damage the pivot on the other side. And put the rest of this chronograph back together. A little bit of grease here. A little sloppy. Clean that up. And we'll push this back. Tighten it down. That's looks okay. It's a little tricky holding this steady and pulling this down in place. Clean this up a little more. Checking the reset. It's not going to snap back into place because things aren't engaged on the dial side. So it's something that let's go back and complete. Our start and stop, and our reset. Now we're back over to our dial side to finish this up. We are getting close, folks. I mentioned the owner of this watch, Mike, was retired. He still gets up at 4 a.m. and he has a booth at our regional flea market. And I visit him on the weekends. I like to check in to see how he's doing. And he treats his customers with a lot of respect, and he gives them joy at very affordable prices. Mike actually sold me my first vintage chronograph. It has a Landron movement in it. So this spring hooks around here, and you have to sort of get these, not just a screw hole aligned, but there are two posts on that spring underneath. So I'm going to get this screw in here partially and make sure those posts on that screw are aligned and in place. I'm going to have to press it in a little bit, and then we'll screw it in all the way. I need to go back in here so I can align that spring. Now we can get our cannon pinion fit. Now you want to be careful. You don't want to just plunge that thing down, because you have to make sure these teeth are aligned, or else you're going to damage it. So I'm going to just kind of soft place it, eyeball it, press it down a little bit further and eyeball it. Once I'm confident those teeth are aligned, I'll go ahead and press the cannon pinion all the way in. Now we can get our hour wheel on. Again, you gotta make sure those teeth are meshed. And I'm gonna loosen up our dial screws. We are very, very close. Dial just looks amazing still. It's hard to believe it's nearly 25 years old. We'll tighten these screws around the dial feet. And we'll work on getting these hands in place. I use a little bit of Rodico to kind of hold the tip of the hand. And I'll try to get it aligned as best I can. And sometimes I can get it dead on first time. Sometimes it needs a little nudge. So you don't want to press them on to get them soft set. You just want to get them on the pinion. And if they're aligned, you try and press them down without shifting them. This is our hour recorder. And now we can get our hour and minute hands on. Just make sure there's nothing wonky going on here. Now we can get our seconds recording hand on. It's a little nudge. Does require some force. Once we get this aligned and set to our satisfaction, we can move to removing what's left of the case back gasket. And we'll sand and polish the crystal and see how nice that looks. And the Omega, there is an Omega symbol on the center of the crystal. That's on the inside. So, you know, don't worry about polishing out that symbol. Let's get to work on casing this thing. You can see that symbol right there in the center. I recently met someone who was wearing the watch his father wore. And after years of wearing that watch, he had never noticed the little Omega symbol in the center of the crystal. He was actually pretty delighted to have discovered something new about it. Feels good. Let's get this turned over and get these case screws in. And we have a fresh case back gasket that's been coated with a very thin layer of silicone grease to keep it supple. I think this is a fantastic looking watch. I have smaller wrists, and even though this is a 42 millimeter watch, it's wearable. I think I would lean more toward the automatic version, which is often referred to as the reduced. It is more of a, I think it's closer to a 39 millimeters, so it's about 3 millimeters smaller. The dial is a little more compressed. It's been really cool to work on this watch. It's really been a gift to work on this watch. Just such an icon in horology, and the fact that I'm able to do it for someone like Mike, it really brings a lot of meaning to this hobby. And I really appreciate you following me through this video. I know it's a long one, and if you're still with me, I really cannot thank you enough. But I'm still going to ask you, if you're not subscribed, please do subscribe. And you know what? Hitting that like button, it really helps more than you might realize. It's a lot of work to do these videos. This was something like 10 hours of video that I had to condense down into a few minutes. It's hours and hours and hours of work. Thank you again. Until next time, take care.